folks, George here. This time we're going to start discussing the moral issues around the death penalty. Is the death penalty morally acceptable? We're going to have to tackle two different sort of flavors of arguments regarding not just the death penalty, but punishment in general. What is the purpose of punishment? On the one hand, you'll have the retributivists who suggest that punishment is about giving retribution to the guilty parties. On the other hand, you have the rehabilitationists who say that punishment shall be about rehabilitating not just the criminal, but also society in general. What is the best rehabilitation to give to criminals, to guilty parties, and also for society in general? First, we're going to tackle the retributivist position. The retributivist position is really taken especially by deontological philosophers, paradigmatic example being Immanuel Kant. We aren't going to read Immanuel Kant's article here, but we are going to read articles by other retributivist philosophers. The philosopher in this retributivist tradition that we will examine today is Igor Primoratz in his article entitled A Life for a Life. He starts his article by saying, according to the retributive theory, consequences are irrelevant to justification. Right? And that's, of course, will remind us, I hope, of Immanuel Kant, who was not concerned about the consequences of moral actions, rather the purpose of moral action. According to Primoratz, punishment is morally justified insofar as it is meted out as retribution. When someone has committed an offense, he deserves punishment. That is the crux of the retribution theory of punishment. Now, to bring it back to the death penalty then, Primoratz reminds us, murder is a unique crime in that it destroys a unique thing, life. Human life is beyond the reach of other values. The guilt of a murderer is infinite because human life is invaluable. Thus, murderers deserve the death penalty because they have destroyed the thing, the only thing in all of existence with infinite value. That is, a human life. Now, this does not presume a theistic outlook, which Primoratz is keen to point out. You don't have to be a religious believer to believe that human life has infinite value. To bring home this point that consequences don't matter, Primoratz reminds us, regarding deterrence, who cares? Maybe the death penalty deters murderers, maybe it doesn't deter murderers. That's got nothing to do with the issue. It doesn't matter. What really matters is giving a just punishment to the guilty, giving the guilty murderer what he deserves. From here, Primoratz reminds us of the social contract philosopher Beccaria. Beccaria, by the way, is against the death penalty. Why? Here's the social contract argument that Beccaria offers. That the state cannot have the right to kill. Why not? Because nobody would ever give up their right to life to the state. Since we deny, according to Beccaria, since we deny the right to suicide, you don't have the right to give up your life. That's why we ban suicide. Again, this is a social contract theory of government and the state. Now, Primoratz recognizes some problems with Beccaria's philosophy. Number one is that Friedrich Hegel reminded us that the state is not a contract. Social contract theories are irrelevant. Well, that's a lot of debate in the history of political philosophy. That aspect of Beccaria's argument isn't going to convince those of us who disagree with social contract theories of government. Furthermore, according to Primoratz, the ban against suicide is quite controversial. Maybe, after all, there is a right to commit suicide. However, against Beccaria's point, committing murder is not a kind of suicide. No murderer really consents to be killed. So that's why social contract theories, at least in this case, are irrelevant and unconvincing regarding the death penalty. Another counter-argument that Primoratz considers is the suggestion that the death penalty violates the right to life and that the right to life is absolute. So to take that a step further, it's even contradictory, isn't it, to say that people have a right to life and thus ban murder, but then the government goes off and kills murderers? That seems contradictory. Here's Primoratz's response to all that. Number one, the right to life is not absolute. Thus, the death penalty is not contradictory, right? After all, if the right to life were absolute, then this would say that war is immoral. And Primoratz clearly thinks that certain wars are at least moral. Some wars at least are moral. The classic example being the war to stop Adolf Hitler and the Nazis from conquering Europe. That would be a moral war, and thus it was okay to kill Nazis to stop the Nazi terror. Another counter that Primoratz offers is that self-defense is clearly allowed, and killing in self-defense is not immoral, is it? Well, for those of us who think that the right to life is absolute, self-defense would have to be immoral, according to Primoratz. But nobody really thinks that. Well, he says, Primoratz does, that clearly this kind of pacifism, that all murder is always wrong, or all killing is always wrong. Primoratz acknowledges that that is a reasonable position, and that it is reasonably possible. However, it's far-fetched. That is, nobody really believes that, do they? After all, consider a murderer on trial. He says, I am a murderer. I have a right to life. How are we supposed to listen to that? Listen to a murderer say, I have a right to life. I killed, yes, but I also have a right to life. Primoratz suggests that's absurd. Rather, when you violate others' rights, you lose rights, according to Primoratz and retribution theory of punishment. By the way, isn't all punishment that way? I have a right to be free and move freely. However, when I do terrible things, like rob banks or kill others, that right to free movement is taken back and I'm put in a cage or in a prison somewhere, aren't I? So clearly, rights are not absolute, and when you violate rights, you lose rights. By the way, if killing murderers is immoral, then guess what else is immoral? Given that logic, then kidnapping kidnappers is also immoral. Yet, isn't that what we do to kidnappers? Somebody kidnaps people, we kidnap them against their will and put them in a prison against their will. What's contradictory about that? Clearly, Primoratz is going to say that can't be contradictory, right? Otherwise, all punishment would be contradictory, according to these absolutists about the right to life. Furthermore, calling the death penalty murder begs the question, according to Primoratz. Primoratz suggests that you're already answering the question at hand by calling it murder. It's not the same as murder, just like killing in self-defense is not the same as murder. Not all killing is murder. Not all killing is the same. Now, Primoratz is going to consider another counterargument. Perhaps the death penalty is unfair or torturous in some way. Primoratz acknowledges that maybe the death penalty is implemented poorly in places like America. However, that's not an argument against the death penalty. That's an argument, Primoratz says, not against the death penalty, but it's an argument against this particular system of justice and how justice is administered in this land. That's not an argument against the death penalty. Another counter-argument that Primoratz considers is, yeah, but with the death penalty, we might make mistakes, and that is a terrible injustice. Primoratz acknowledges that fact, right? That some innocent people might be executed via the death penalty. Primoratz acknowledges that's a serious problem. However, that's, again, only against procedural issues. Perhaps it's a quirk of American government that innocent people are killed. After all, by the way, aren't there some special cases where everybody knows who did it? Right? I'm thinking of all the famous serial killers who confessed to things. We know that person did it. We know that person is guilty. Perhaps in a just system, we ought to change the way death penalty is administered so that there is something like 100% guarantee, knowledge, certainty that that person is guilty of murder, right? That's not an argument against the death penalty. That's an argument against the procedural aspect of justice in some society, let's say. By the way, Primoratz adds one more interesting argument to support the death penalty. If we don't give murderers the death penalty, then we're actually privileging murderers, aren't we? Because after all, we give everybody else what they deserve in punishment, but we don't give murderers what they deserve in punishment if we don't murder murderers. And of course, that would be a grave injustice. Now, the final argument that Primoratz is going to tackle is the notion that the death penalty in places like America is racist or discriminatory in some ways. Primoratz acknowledges that might be the case. However, again, that's not an argument against the death penalty. That's an argument against the justice system in America. By the way, if that were actually a valid argument, then guess what that really means? What that really means, if it were a valid argument that the death penalty is racist in some way, what it really means is that all punishment should be abolished. And clearly nobody believes that. Well, in fact, some people do believe that, right? But Primoratz is going to say, to speak to those of us who do believe that some punishment should still be in place. If you really believe that the death penalty is racist or discriminatory in some way, that's not an argument against the death penalty. That's an argument against the whole justice system. And thus, the whole justice system should be abolished, not just the death penalty, if that argument were valid. Primoratz doesn't think that argument is valid. So, those are the key points that Primoratz offers in support of the retribution theory, in support of the death penalty. See you next time. Bye-bye.